When I first noticed that the Empire's banners were being stripped of their golden emblems and repainted with cheap alloy, I realized something had cracked, not in the metal, but in us. Everything looked the same: ships in orbit, orchestras honoring the Emperor, endless speeches about unity. But the air carried the scent of rust. It didn't come from the hulls of star frigates, it came from the people. I saw captains arguing over supplies, officers falsifying reports, entire crews vanishing into the void with cargo containers full of resources. We had been the empire the galaxy feared, and now we resembled an old ship where everyone only fixes their own cabin and hopes the lower deck doesn't flood too soon. And yet, I still believed things could be fixed if only someone reached the control panel and turned the lever slightly to the left, as if moral direction could be set by a navigation system. The first cracks didn't appear in the palace walls, but between planets. The central worlds wanted to keep power, claiming it was for stability, while the outer colonies, surviving on asteroid dust, demanded freedom. I was stationed at Eris 9 when our commander ordered the cargo routes blocked. He said it was temporary, to maintain order. But when cities began to starve, I realized no one intended to preserve anything, only profit. People on the planet saw us as occupiers, and we ourselves began to feel ashamed of our emblem. That was the first time I saw our cruiser's crew, officers I trusted with my life, sabotage their own engines to avoid another cleansing raid. They said they were tired of fighting for the Emperor's shadow. Then came the day the warehouse at the main docking station exploded. They said it was a rebel attack, but I had seen our technicians whispering in the corridors just the day before, exchanging codes. Everything started to feel like a farce. Generals held secret talks with separatists, diplomats sold intel to fleets, and we, the mid-level officers, just tried to figure out who we were supposed to call the enemy today. I was ordered to patrol a sector already under the control of the League of Free Worlds. Command knew this, but the order had a seal, and that was enough to send us to certain death. In the space between stars, I saw wreckage from our own ships and nearby, signals from our former allies. And no one asked anymore who fired the first shot. The climax was the attack on the capital. We received the invasion alert while still celebrating Empire Day, an irony I felt in every bone. I stood on the bridge when the screen showed the silhouette of a planet engulfed in flames. Refugees, soldiers, senators, merchants. They all tried to flee, all searching for someone to take command. But the Emperor was silent. Rumors said his ship vanished into hyperspace, that he escaped, or that his own advisors betrayed him. I didn't care about the truth then. I just watched our capital fall apart in orbit like a symbol of exhaustion no longer held together by bolts. I couldn't shoot, couldn't run, only stood and listened as the civilization we built over 3 millennia burned. When the war ended, there were no victors, only universal decay and a power vacuum. The mighty fleet fragmented into dozens of factions, each proclaiming itself the heir to the empire. These groups, whether fanatical revanchists or cynical preachers of peace, were united only by hypocritical lies about the future. Having seen too much, I refused to swear allegiance to anyone. My ship, battered and empty, drifted among the gravitational debris. In this isolation, I felt not cosmic silence, but human silence, a complete absence of orders, duty, or a shared dream of order. All that remained were the indifferent ancient stars, impassive witnesses to our final fall. Now, I fly between the ruins of former systems, helping those who survived. On the remains of stations, you can still find parts of old machinery, and sometimes children's toys floating in zero gravity. People try to start over, but sometimes I see their eyes shine when they talk about the past, like it's a myth. They don't remember the corruption, betrayal, or lies, only heroic tales of the empire. And I don't correct them. Maybe that's for the best. Because if we forget how things fall apart, maybe someday we'll build something that doesn't need patching every century. I never thought I'd witness the galaxy literally tear tearing itself in half. It didn't start with war or gunfire, but with a Senate meeting that seemed to be about boring logistics. I was down below in the technical sector, monitoring life support systems and eating my freeze-dried soup straight from the packet when the broadcast cut off. Half the delegates jumped up and started waving their arms. The other half shouted they'd been betrayed. At first I thought it was another signal glitch, but no, it was a glitch in people. They couldn't share power anymore, couldn't even share airtime. Some yelled that the Imperial Center was draining resources from the outer worlds. Others said without the center the galaxy would fall into chaos. I wasn't a politician, but even I could tell chaos had already begun. We just hadn't named it yet. After that, the docks grew tense. Every other ship left for repairs and never came back. Entire systems started disappearing from navigation maps, marked simply as unavailable. Officially, it was temporary communication outages, but everyone knew planet after planet was declaring independence. My captain said it was a trend, like in the old days. First, everyone colonized, then everyone broke away. I laughed then, but inside, I felt sick. In orbit, we intercepted pirate signals from former fleet officers calling for freedom of the worlds. They sounded too sincere not to be frightening. I remember how flyers with the symbol of the League of Free Systems started showing up on our deck. Someone was secretly spreading them right in the cabins, and no one knew who. Even the scanners couldn't trace the source. And then, people started disappearing, quietly, without noise, without gunfire. They just didn't show up for duty. When we were ordered to intercept the Separatist convoy, I didn't feel proud like I used to. We were no longer defenders of the Empire. We'd become its blunt weapon. They told us the convoy was smuggling contraband, but after the battle, we found no weapons, only refugees. Children, the elderly, women who just wanted to escape planets where the riots had already begun. Our soldiers stayed silent. No one knew what to do with this cargo, people who were now considered enemies. The commander said he'd hand them over to the control service, but I saw him that night personally open the airlock and release the transport into open space. He told me he couldn't keep shooting at people who just wanted to live. That was the first time I realized discipline isn't armor. It's a prison. And if you wear it too long, it starts to crush you from the inside. Then came the day the Senate ceased to exist. It just went silent. No broadcasts, no decisions, no orders. We drifted in silence, not knowing who we belonged to anymore. The Imperial fleet fractured like everything else. Some ships adopted new emblems, others repainted the old ones. Rumors spread through internal channels. Fighting had broken out in the capital, the Emperor had evacuated, and now each admiral decided for themselves who was an enemy and who was an ally. We tried to stay in formation, but discipline in space is an illusion. In a vacuum, no one hears orders unless you choose to listen. One night, I woke to a dull thud. One of our cruisers had self-destructed to avoid capture. We saw the flash through the viewports and stood in silence. We didn't even sound the alarm. What for, when burning had become our shared language? A few cycles later, I ended up on a planet still loyal to the center. They welcomed us as heroes, but the governor's eyes didn't shine with pride, more like fear. He said Imperial garrisons were disappearing from neighboring worlds, that people were tired of foreign orders. He offered for us to stay, saying it was safer on the surface, but I already saw the calculation in his gaze. He just wanted us to become his army. And we stayed, not out of loyalty, but exhaustion. For months we repaired the ship, listened to news that came in fragments, one system declaring itself free, another consumed by an atomic blast. We sat in the bar, joked that the Empire had just gone on vacation, but each of us knew. Vacations don't last forever, only ruins do. I still don't know who won that war. Maybe no one did. After all these years, I fly an old transport that still bears Imperial lettering, delivering supplies to colonies that call themselves independent. They pay in scraps, but I'm not doing it for that. Sometimes, when I sit by a beacon and watch the wreckage of old fleets slowly spin around me, I feel like they're waiting too, for a signal that will never come. People ask why I don't return to the Central Worlds. I just don't want to see someone painting gold yellow again, trying to make it look like it still shines. The Empire didn't die when the capital fell. It died when we stopped trusting each other. And yet, when I pass by the old beacons, I always send out a short pulse into the ether, just in case someone out there still remembers what true unity sounded like. I always thought sabotage was something out of history books, where heroes blow up bridges and save civilizations. But when the first warehouse on the Canopus orbital station exploded right above me, I realized the romance of sabotage is wildly overrated. We were in the cargo bay checking plasma fuel reserves when everything suddenly lit up with such a blinding flash that even our helmet filters couldn't handle it. I woke up in the med bay, staring at the starry sky through a torn hull where the ceiling used to be. At first, I thought it was just an accident. It happens. But then, data started disappearing, navigation systems glitched, ships vanished from radar like ghosts, and it all happened too systematically to be random. Command said it was technical failures, but I saw fear in their eyes. Not confusion, fear. That was the first time I wondered if we were no longer in control of our own fleet. A few days after the explosion, we were ordered to inspect the warehouses at a nearby base. Everything looked the same. Tense guards, dim corridors, and the smell of burnt insulation in the air. I joked that it must be the new imperial fragrance, panic with a hint of ozone. But no one laughed. When we opened the central bay, we found empty frames instead of crates of parts. Turned out someone had been removing equipment for weeks, altering the logs to cover it up. Even the security drones didn't catch the swap, or pretended not to. Our technician said the algorithms had been rewritten, but I saw his hands shaking as he said it. That night, I woke up to my cabin door opening on its own. In the dark, the green light of the security system blinked. Someone was entering under my ID. But when I ran into the corridor, no one was there. Just a faint whisper in the comms, a short pulse, repeating a word over and over. Shut down. Then the real sabotage began. Someone disabled navigation buoys, causing entire ship caravans to lose course and crash into asteroids. Sometimes, we found wreckage drifting in the vacuum, charred hull fragments, containers, antenna pieces still transmitting distress signals into nothing. Our captain ordered tighter security and manual checks on all connections, but it didn't help. In fact, more systems failed each day, like someone was methodically disconnecting us from the rest of the Empire. We even joked that maybe the Empire itself was cleaning house, shutting us down like old servers. But the jokes stopped quickly when a red marker lit up on the console, a signal of an internal attack. Our own turrets opened fire on the hangars. After that, we didn't joke anymore. As the investigation dragged on, suspicion spread through the fleet. Everyone looked at their neighbor as a potential traitor. We stopped trusting even the AIs, shut down automation, and calculated trajectories by hand, like we were back in the early days of space travel. I used to think the goal was to find the culprit, but the longer we searched, the more it became clear. Maybe everyone was guilty. Some sold data, some quietly covered up crimes, some just looked the other way to keep their position. It all felt like a massive system devouring itself. One day, I noticed our own black boxes were sending data copies to an unknown sector. The technician said it was a routing error, but when I tried to trace the signal, it led to one of our flagships, the one that, according to official records, burned up 3 months ago. The climax came when gravity suddenly shut off on the main ship. Everyone floated into the air, and the chaos looked almost comical. Generals grabbing onto pipes, officers chasing their tablets, and me, unable to hold back laughter. It must have been a breakdown, because laughter in the void sounds terrifying. Then, everything exploded. Half the fleet lost control, systems triggered evacuation protocols on their own, and command modules vanished from radar. When we finally stabilized the ship, I saw through the viewport one of our stations splitting in half, with fire bending in the vacuum like it was alive. At that moment, it felt like sabotage wasn't caused by people. The universe itself was trying to get rid of us, like a useless element blocking evolution. Now, when I think back to those days, it's funny how afraid we were of the enemies of the empire. The worst enemy was always inside, our need to hide the truth and pretend we were in control. I still serve in the fleet, though now it feels more like a pile of wreckage than an army. We fly between empty stations, searching for remnants of past glory and logging new protocols, even though everyone knows they'll disappear soon too. Sometimes, when I see an old access code on the screen, the same one that opened my cabin door back then, I feel like someone or something is still playing the game. And maybe sabotage never really ended. Maybe we're all just playing our part without knowing who's really behind the script. I always thought space smelled like metal and loneliness. But the first time I smelled burnt oxygen in the cabin, I knew I was wrong. Space smells like fear. Not the primal, panicked fear before death, but the quiet, thick kind, like cold oil, the fear you feel when everything around you is falling apart and you still have to follow orders. We were in orbit around Meridian then, a planet they'd called the Jewel of the Empire just a week earlier. Now, it was a scorched shell. I remember that first battle not for the explosions or the losses, but for how beautifully the shattered ship fragments glowed, spinning in the void like someone had scattered stars. I didn't know yet that it was only the beginning, and that soon we'd be firing not at rebels, but at those who'd sat beside us in the officers' mess just yesterday. When the war started, no one wanted to admit it was a war. They called it local clashes, incidents, stabilization operations. Imperial propaganda did its job. We believed the enemy was out there, beyond the nebulas, not among us. But then, a fleet appeared on radar, carrying Imperial insignia, and the command center's order was clear. Open fire. No one dared ask why. We just followed orders, because it was easier. The first volleys pierced the flagship's armor, and I watched its hull slowly melt under the fire. Something cracked inside me then. I realized the word traitor had become relative. Today you're a defender of the Empire. Tomorrow you're a target for its own guns. The irony is, by destroying someone else's ships, we were tearing apart our own belief. Then, the real meat grinder began. Every day, another battle, new orders, fresh casualty lists. I stopped remembering planet names. Everything blurred into one endless hell of flashes and radio static. We became like machines, following commands without emotion. Sometimes I caught myself getting used to the screams over comms, the pleas for help, the brief navigation failure right before a ship turned into a ball of fire. That scared me more than the fighting itself. Because when death becomes routine, you're already half dead. I once tried to write down the names of the fallen in a personal journal, but gave up quickly. There wouldn't be enough paper, even if I wrote in tiny letters. When we were moved to the outer edges, things got worse. Where the Empire's borders used to be, there were now voids, entire sectors with no communication, no orders, no purpose. We became our own command. Ships aged, systems glitched, people lost their minds. They said one captain just opened the airlock and stepped into the vacuum. No suit, no reason. I didn't believe it until I saw our squadron commander sitting in his cabin with the lights off, talking to someone who wasn't there. He told me, "The Empire is rotting from the inside, and the voice of the stars demands cleansing." I didn't know what to say. In moments like that, you realize madness has become the new law of gravity. It pulls everyone down, no exceptions. When the order for a full offensive finally came, no one believed in victory anymore. We just moved forward out of inertia, like old ships someone forgot to shut down. Our guns fired automatically, targeting systems ran blind. I saw the enemy fleet, once our allies, retreating, abandoning whatever they could, but we didn't look any better. No one knew why we were fighting. The Empire had collapsed, but the momentum of war kept dragging it forward. Hundreds of ships battled in silence, each explosion echoing someone else's mistake. I remember thinking maybe these battles weren't about winning, just about giving meaning to those who'd long since lost it. Now, as I write this, There's only cold and stars around me. My ship drifts without fuel. Comms are dead, and the only light comes from the red emergency lamp. I don't know who won or if anyone ever could. The Empire is dead, and we're its fragments, floating in the void until we finally go dark. Funny, I spent my whole life dreaming of seeing space, and now I see it as it truly is, quiet, indifferent, endless. And maybe that's the truth. The universe doesn't divide us into winners and losers. It just waits for us to stop making noise. When I heard that Admiral Vorn had joined the Separatists, I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, just a nervous reaction. I'd served under his command for nearly 5 years, and during that time, he seemed like a man made of steel, strict, cold, but fair. He knew how to keep the fleet in line, forcing even the most stubborn pilots to follow orders. And now, this same man, whom we saw as a symbol of the Empire, suddenly declared that the Central Command has lost the moral right to govern the galaxy. Just like that. No emotion, no drama, dry and military-like. At first I thought it was some kind of virus in the news network, a fake broadcast. But then came the order to block all communication channels with his sector. That was too serious to be a joke. That's when I realized if even someone like Vorn walks away, the cracks in the Empire aren't just real. They're right beneath our feet. That day, the ship was eerily quiet. No one said anything, but everyone understood. Trust was dead. We used to argue about orders, complain about bureaucracy, but deep down, we knew we were on the same side. Now, everything had changed. Even the look from your cabin neighbor felt suspicious. I caught myself tracking who talked to whom, who stayed silent, who shut down their terminal too quickly. And the ship's commander said, "No need to panic," but he didn't take off his armored jacket even in his sleep. Officers pretended everything was under control, but every other one kept a weapon close. And when the ammo depot exploded that night, no one was surprised. They just nodded, like they'd been expecting it. Ironically, the more the Empire talked about order, the deeper we sank into chaos. Vorn knew where to strike. His fleet didn't just leave. It took half the fuel reserves, strategic data, and dozens of officers with it. We tried to track them, but the navigation beacons showed complete nonsense. One of the techs said they might be using reflective signatures, banned tech with no official records. At some point, I found myself starting to understand Vorn. Not his actions, but his reasons. Maybe he was just tired of pretending everything was under control. We were fighting shadows, hiding behind orders written by people who'd never seen open space. Maybe he wanted to prove that even a general is just a person who gets scared too. But admitting that meant admitting weakness. And in the Empire, weakness was a crime. A week later, we were sent to the zone where his command center was supposedly located. Mission, recon, and interception. In reality, another attempt to convince ourselves the Empire could still act. I stood on the bridge, staring into the ink-black void of space when his ship's signature appeared on radar. Helios, a massive cruiser, once the pride of the fleet, now a symbol of betrayal. Its hull glowed from shield discharges like it was trying to erase its own past. We approached, but it didn't fire. Just drifted, like it was waiting. That's when I knew Vorn had already made his decision. A few minutes later, the cruiser flared like a star and vanished in a blinding light. Later they said it was a trap, that he faked his death. But I saw it with my own eyes. Helios exploded from the inside, and with it burned away all the answers we'd been searching for. After that incident, the Empire ordered a cleansing of the ranks. Interrogations, inspections, arrests began. Every day someone from the crew was taken away, and no one came back. I tried not to think about it, but the feeling that we were now living inside a cage became unbearable. They used to say trust was the glue that held the Empire together. If that's true, our glue had long since dried up. People stopped believing not just in command, but in each other. Some whispered that Vorn was still alive and building a new fleet, waiting for us on the edge of the galaxy where the stars fade slowly. I don't know if that's true. But sometimes, when I look out the viewport and see distant lights, it feels like one of them blinks, like someone out there is sending a signal. And in those moments, I think maybe the Admiral just left the sinking ship first, and we stayed behind, now sinking in silence. I'd never seen a lie look so elegant. At diplomatic receptions, it smelled like expensive wine, reflected off polished tables, and shimmered in the eyes of people who smiled while talking about peace, but held knives behind their backs. I was assigned to the mission as an observer, officially for reports, unofficially to find out which of our diplomats were already looking for an exit. I, a fleet officer, ended up among people who fought not with guns, but with words. And honestly, it was scarier. When the enemy's in your sights, it's simple. The strongest survives. But when the person across from you is smiling and might sell your sector's coordinates to the enemy tomorrow, that's when you realize the real war isn't in space. It's here, behind these perfectly set tables. We all called it shadow diplomacy, but in reality, it was the trade of human lives. Every meeting followed the same script: smiles, toasts, talk of cooperation opportunities. I listened as representatives of the Empire and the Separatists discussed a shared future, while thousands of soldiers died on the front lines, believing they were fighting for a cause. Sometimes a diplomat would toss out a line like, "Peace is always a compromise." And I wanted to stand up and shout, "And how many lives does one of those compromises cost?" But I stayed silent, because in that world, words were weapons, and one careless word could cost not just your career, but your life. The most disgusting part was that both sides genuinely believed they were the saviors. The Imperials said without them, everything would fall into chaos. The Separatists claimed they were fighting for freedom. And both drank the same drinks, joked about the same things, and left the room wearing the same masks of indifference. At some point, I started noticing a pattern. The louder the speeches about peace, the more reports came in about new battles. It felt like these negotiations weren't stopping the war, they were feeding it. I heard whispers in the hallways about secret deals. One sector promised loyalty in exchange for autonomy, another offered resources for recognition. Some sold convoy routes, others sold the names of defectors. Peace had become a marketplace, and the currency was honor. I realized the real generals weren't in armor or on fleets. They sat in expensive suits deciding who would live and who would die tomorrow. Sometimes I caught myself missing honest gunfire. At least there, it was simple. It's you or them. Here, there were no hours, only useful and temporarily necessary. I especially remember one night on the Orbital 6 station, where an unofficial meeting between delegates from both sides took place. We were positioned above a planet that was burning below, literally burning, its atmosphere ablaze from bombardments. Through the viewports, you could see glowing lines of explosions stretching across the surface, while inside the hall, soft music played, gentle, like self-deception. One of the diplomats said, "This is all temporary," and that peace is closer than ever. He raised his glass, and at that moment I realized it wasn't cynicism, it was belief. They truly believed they could buy peace like a commodity. They didn't need to see the bodies in orbit or hear the screams from destroyed stations. They dealt in numbers, and numbers don't scream. That was the first time I felt like I was on the other side of the mirror, where everything is reversed, where death is just statistics and conscience is a luxury. Later, I was assigned to write a report on the negotiations. I sat in front of the terminal, staring at a blank screen, not knowing what to write. Officially, I was supposed to note progress in finding compromises. But what kind of progress is there when thousands of bodies lie behind both sides? I typed a few lines, then erased them. In the end, I sent an empty file. Maybe that was the only honest report I ever submitted during my service. A week later, I was transferred back to the fleet. The reason given was loss of diplomatic effectiveness. And you know what? I actually felt relieved. Out there on the front lines where lasers fire and ships explode, at least things are honest. War, as terrible as it is, doesn't pretend to be peace. Now, looking back on it all, I think maybe the empire didn't fall to an external enemy, but to its own cunning. We built the trap ourselves and got tangled in it. A system where words became stronger than actions, where reports mattered more than lives, and truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. We learned to hide lies behind heroic slogans and call fear prudence. The shadow covered everything: the fleet, diplomacy, belief, even conscience. We didn't lose planets or people. We lost the meaning we lived for. And maybe that's why even the stars seem dimmer. Like us, they're tired of shining for those who no longer know how to look up. I still don't understand how I ended up between two armadas, each one calling me a traitor. One fleet called me a coward, the other a fanatic of the old regime. And I was just following orders until I realized both sides were leading us to the same place, into the void. That day, when my monitors showed two identical fleets moving toward each other, I felt for the first time that the empire was truly dying. Not in battle, not from plasma strikes, but from within, from people who stopped seeing the difference between honor and advantage. I remember the engines humming, the hull of the ship trembling from rising tension, and I thought, maybe if I shut off communications, the war would stop existing for just a minute. But the order came, and I became part of the absurdity again, where it was no longer possible to tell the enemy from the reflection in the mirror. At first, I still tried to believe that all of this made sense, that if you followed the regulations, stuck to protocol, and respected the chain of command, everything would fall into place. But then, the shadow deals began, the kind whispered about even in officers' quarters. I saw captains disappear after closed meetings, entire squadrons lost in hyperspace, only to suddenly reappear on the other side of the front. They called it diplomacy. I called it rot. We weren't fighting for ideals. We were trading lives like goods in a market where honor was the main currency. And the higher the rank, the cheaper it became. When I was assigned to escort a delegation to negotiations with the colonies, I thought things couldn't get any worse. The talks were a farce. The room smelled of overheated metal and fear, and the ambassador's eyes gleamed like the lenses of old drones. No one spoke to persuade, only to gather leverage. I saw my commander exchange glances with the opposition as if there was an invisible agreement between them, older than any of our orders. That was the first time I felt disgust, not toward the enemy but toward myself, because I was sitting at the same table in the same shadow. Later, when one of our ships hit its own mines, I realized sabotage had become a new language. We no longer fired weapons. We made deals, so the explosions looked like accidents. Every fleet had its ghosts, people who sold coordinates, routes, codes. Sometimes they vanished, sometimes they got promoted. I no longer knew who among us was still a soldier and who had long since become a bureaucrat in uniform. Everything blurred: loyalty, fear, cynicism. I could feel the air grow heavier, as if the station itself understood we'd crossed a line with no way back. Then came the night I had to choose: follow orders or keep my conscience. I was told to destroy a transport carrying refugees from neutral planets. I knew their deaths would serve as a convenient political gesture, but when the targeting system locked onto the ship, I simply cut the power. Warnings flashed on the screens, the automation demanded confirmation, and I stared out the window at the stars. They looked so distant, as if they despised us. I didn't report my disobedience. I just stepped into the shadows like many before me. They say I've been erased from all protocols. Maybe that's for the best. Now, looking back on it all, I think maybe the empire didn't collapse because of an external enemy, but because of its own cunning. We built the trap ourselves and got tangled in it, a system where words became stronger than actions, where reports mattered more than lives, and truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. We learned to hide lies behind heroic slogans and call fear prudence. The shadow covered everything: the fleet, diplomacy, belief, even conscience. We didn't lose planets or people. We lost the meaning we lived for. And maybe that's why even the stars seemed dimmer, Like us, they're tired of shining for those who no longer know how to look up. I'll never forget the day the sky above the Empire's capital lit up brighter than any star in the galaxy. At first, I thought it was another drill or an atmospheric flare. But then the monitors lit up with warning signals. The Separatist fleet had broken through the defenses and was heading straight for the seat of power. I stood on the bridge, feeling a cold panic rise in my chest, realizing that everything we knew about order, laws, and commands was collapsing in that moment. We tried to fire, but the defense system failed, as if the Empire itself, watching what was happening, chose not to intervene. Engines roared around us, damage indicators flashed, and I watched red bursts slice through the clouds like bloody lightning, knowing those lights were writing the end of an entire era. When the alarm first sounded, hundreds of alerts about destruction in the government sector flashed across the console in front of me. I saw palaces and administrative centers literally vaporize under precise strikes, and with them, the illusion of safety crumbled. We tried to coordinate counterattacks, but orders came late or not at all. Communications were cut, and the most experienced officers were either wounded or trapped at their posts. I realized the entire fleet had become part of a chaos no one could control. Every attempt to defend the capital turned into a trap, and every new command added more tension and uncertainty. That night, for the first time, I felt I could lose not just my life, but the meaning behind everything I was doing. The Separatists acted ruthlessly and fast. I saw on the screens how their ships sliced through the atmosphere, how energy beams pierced the defense fields, leaving fiery trails behind, and how panic among civilians grew by the minute. People ran through the streets gripped by fear, while we on the bridge tried to figure out what else could be done. I caught myself thinking that I used to see war as something distant, abstract, but now I saw it face to face, heard its breath, and felt its pain. Every time I watched another flagship fall, I understood the Empire wasn't just losing buildings and ships, it was losing the symbols that had held us together. When the main government complex exploded, I felt something snap inside me, not pain, not fear, emptiness. I understood that the structure holding our authority had collapsed, and with it, people's belief in justice and order. My colleagues tried to stay calm, but I saw their hands shaking, their eyes glinting with tension. We were fighting the ghosts of yesterday's orders, facing a new reality where no one knew who made the rules, who the leader was, or who had betrayed us. Everything we were taught turned out to be an illusion, and the only thing left was to try to survive in the whirlwind of destruction and shadow left by the attack. I remember how the stars on the horizon felt foreign, as if the universe was watching us from above, baffled by our stupidity. Each explosion lit up the faces of soldiers still trying to act, even though they knew it was over. I stood and watched as satellite orbits fell one by one, as fire engulfed government buildings and enemy ships maneuvered, ready for the next strike. In that moment, I realized the war had changed all of us. We could no longer tell enemy from ally, duty from fear, honor from survival. Everything blurred into a chaos that couldn't be described with words. It was felt in everything, from the trembling hull to the vibration in the air that once felt safe. When the attack ended, only ruins and silence remained, a silence that couldn't be called peace. I saw remnants of the government hiding in concealed sectors, the fleet trying to restore some kind of coordination. But I already knew. The old empire was dead. We who remained had become shadows of our former roles, trying to find meaning where none was left. I stood on the bridge, looking at the ruined capital, and for the first time felt that even space, merciless and cold, had witnessed what we lost. Not just cities, not just ships, but faith in the very system we once fought for. The stars looked dim, as if they too were tired of shining over a world that had long forgotten what it meant to live with integrity. I never thought chaos could feel so tangible until I found myself among my own fleet, which had turned into a living organism without a brain. Every admiral acted on their own, every ship saw itself as the center of the universe, and orders came late, if at all. I sat on the bridge, watching coordinates from one unit overlap with fire from another, and realized we had created our own hell. In our past lives, we took pride in synchronization, precision, discipline. And now, even a simple maneuver turned into tragedy. Lasers missed their targets, collided with our own shields, and crews shouted, trying to figure out who was still alive and who had already betrayed us. It felt like the entire empire had become a ship with a broken helm, and we were flying straight into a meteor cloud, screaming and laughing at the same time, because anything else, and panic would have devoured us instantly. With every passing hour, the disorder only grew worse. Generals argued across space, ignoring each other, and I kept thinking that even if someone survived, no one would be able to tell the truth about what happened. Sometimes, it felt like all these people were playing a game where the goal wasn't victory, but simply proving that their word, their decision, held power. And at some point I realized there was no right or wrong here, no enemy or ally, only whoever was still alive at the end of the day. I looked at the maps, where fleet movement lines crossed and broke like old wires, and felt that reality had become elusive. Everything we were taught about order and discipline had vanished along with those who once held it all together. I saw small units trying to act independently, sending their forces to help neighbors or cover retreats, but instead they created new chaotic clashes. Signal drones misfired, combat channels overloaded, and sometimes it felt like the very space around the ships vibrated from the tension. Communication lines turned into a mess of signals, and every move took immense effort just to avoid friendly fire. I caught myself subconsciously treating every new order as a potential trap, and most of the time, that's exactly what it was. Everything around us became a strange dance where every step could be fatal. There was a strange feeling, like the fleet had come alive and was leading its own unpredictable, wild existence. I saw generals making decisions while ignoring their advisors, as if relying on instinct instead of logic or strategy. Each one saw themselves as the rightful heir to power, and I, a simple officer, was caught between their ambitions like a leaf in a hurricane. I tried to figure out what else could be done to restore order, but everything I did only made things worse. We lost ships not to the enemy, but to our own confusion and ambition, and every new encounter with the opposition felt like a reflection of the internal chaos within our command. And when I looked at the map, dotted with points marking our ships and theirs, I realized we weren't fighting an external enemy. We were fighting ourselves. Every admiral, every captain, every technician had become a separate force, unwilling to follow a shared plan. I saw small fleets vanish without completing their missions, and I understood there were no heroes here, and there would be no victors, only those who could survive the next explosion, the next mistake. I tried to hold the line, but sometimes it felt like we were holding it with the hands of the entire galaxy, which itself had grown tired of rules and orders. Now, looking back on those hours, I realized that the breakdown in command became a symbol of the Empire's end. Not just as a political entity, but as an idea of order and justice. We didn't lose control because of enemies, but because of our own egos, our own sense of importance. Everyone saw themselves as the center of the universe, and in the end, that universe collapsed. I still see the trembling lines on the monitors, hear the engines colliding with each other, and understand. Sometimes war isn't a fight against an external enemy, but watching your own people destroy everything that was once sacred and untouchable. The stars seemed cold and indifferent then, because they watched us lose not planets and ships, but the very ability to tell order from chaos. I'll never forget the moment we approached the central star, feeling like everything was about to be decided. Its light shone blindingly, as if the universe itself was watching the final game between the Empire and the Separatists, and each beam reflected off the ship's armor, making them look like floating sparks in the chaos. I stood on the bridge, trying to grasp the scale of what was happening, but every second brought new horrifying details: damage alerts, explosions in the compartments, crooked trajectories of battleships shaking under the force of energy and plasma. It felt like space itself was straining to endure the nightmare, and we inside it like flies on glass about to crack. I saw friends fall, hulls split open, and thought, we're fighting not just for planets, but for the memory of who we once were. Every move in that battle was deadly. I saw crews lose their bearings, ships crashing in whirlwinds of fire and smoke like living creatures beyond control. My eyes jumped from one monitor to another, tracking destruction, but my brain refused to process it all at once. I tried to find some kind of order, even a hint of strategy, but soon realized there was none left. Everything came down to moments: who reacted faster, who accidentally slipped under a shield, who survived and who didn't. That's when I understood that great fleets and legendary commanders could be powerless against the chaos they themselves had created. In the middle of the battle, I felt a strange mix of terror and awe. Plasma beams tore through space like a painter's brush, drawing bizarre lines of light, and the explosions and flying debris turned the void into a colorful nightmare. I saw our ships vanish in flames, the enemy doing the same, and thought, if someone were watching this from the outside, they wouldn't know where the battle was and where the meaningless cosmic fireworks began. My body trembled, my heart tightened from the tension, but at the same time, I felt an odd calm. It was a moment when, despite the chaos, we existed here and now, feeling every detail, every flash, every loss. We were losing people and ships by the minute. I saw fragments of hull armor bouncing off shields, life support systems failing, fire and smoke filling compartments where friends had stood just seconds before. Commanders shouted orders that vanished into radio static, and I tried to keep the fleet afloat, knowing full well that losing control was inevitable. It felt like the star itself was watching us with disappointment, its light exposing every mistake, every betrayal, and all the human weakness that had now become part of every ship, every soldier, every moment. When we reached the climax of the battle, I realized for the first time that this fight wasn't about victory. It was about survival. Some ships that had seemed invincible just that morning disappeared in seconds, and the ones that remained moved like shadows of their former selves. I saw an admiral, once unshakable, lose his mind and send the fleet into a fire zone, as if fate itself wanted to test our limits. I tried to find meaning in the chaos, but no answer came. Only fire, explosions, and the cold beauty of space, which felt more honest than any command or strategy. When the battle ended, the remaining ships stood like weary shadows against the blinding light of the star. I looked at the damaged hulls, heard desperate signals from survivors, and lost all sense of time. Did we win? Or did we just survive the final nightmare? Bitterness and gratitude mixed in my heart. We lost too much, but we were still alive to remember. I realized that even in catastrophe, there's a strange kind of beauty. The beauty of endurance, the beauty of chaos, the beauty of still being able to feel as we watch the light that seemed to come from the galactic center itself, despite all the destruction around us. I never thought I'd be able to stand and witness the end of something that once felt eternal. When the Empire's capital fell, I saw buildings that had symbolized strength and power collapse in clouds of dust and fire, leaving behind only charred frames and smoking ruins. From the bridge of my ship, I watched the remnants of the Senate try to regroup, but there were too few voices left, and most members had either vanished or lost all faith. It felt like the universe itself had paused to watch the disappearance of a system we'd spent centuries building, and for the first time, I felt a strange mix of horror and relief. Horror at the loss of order, and relief that we would no longer be fooled by the illusion that everything and everyone could be controlled. When the first independent states began declaring autonomy, I felt a strange mix of pride and unease. A bitter joy for the worlds that had broken free from old bureaucracy and oppression, was mixed with the realization that every new leader would now act by their own rules, and the old order, at least the one that held things together formally, was gone for good. I saw planets glowing green on the screens, symbols of new beginnings, while others glowed red like warnings that chaos hadn't left. I understood that our mission now was to survive among the wreckage, to find meaning where old laws no longer applied, and not to get lost in the void of possibilities that once felt like freedom, but now felt like a cold galactic emptiness. I remember how we tried to re-establish even the faintest lines of communication between the remnants of the fleet. Every message, every signal felt like a cry into the void. Who would hear it? Who would respond? Who would survive? I watched ships glide between shattered orbits like shadows of former strength, and each maneuver was a balance between life and death. We no longer had centralized command, and every officer became both judge and criminal to their crew. I felt that the responsibility for preserving humanity now rested on each of us, and the past we once defended had become a story we could retell, but never reclaim. In that chaos, I felt for the first time that the galaxy itself was learning from our mistakes. The screens showed new cities and civilizations rising from the ruins of old worlds, while old flags and emblems faded like memories of the past. I watched as people on planets once loyal to the Empire began forming their own governments, writing new laws, and sometimes even building cults around ancestors who failed to protect them from collapse. It was both unsettling and beautiful. Human resilience emerging even where collapse seemed final, where ruins still smoked and the fire hadn't cooled. I understood that we were witnessing the birth of a new world, and at the same time realized that our own mark on this map would be remembered not just for heroism, but for the mistakes that left scars behind. With each passing day, the ruins of the capital became a symbol of the past, and I often looked at them from the ship as if trying to draw lessons. I saw the wreckage of palaces, bent structures of spaceports, empty streets where life once thrived, and thought about how easily people grow used to power, forgetting that it's fragile and mortal. I saw new planetary leaders forming their first councils, passing their first laws, trying to avoid the mistakes that led to the Empire's downfall. And in those moments, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. We had lost everything, but we now had the chance to rebuild, without illusions, without betrayal, without the empty promises that once held us together only on paper. Now that the Empire has become history, I understand that its collapse was inevitable. It came not only from external pressure, but from internal contradictions, ambition, fear, and the trust we failed to preserve. I stood on the bridge, watching new nations emerge from the wreckage of the old order, and felt a strange relief. The starlight reflecting in my eyes no longer felt cold and indifferent, but like a sign that life goes on, that even after collapse, there's a chance for a beginning we can build with our own hands. We lost the Empire, but gained the chance to live honestly, and maybe that's the true victory among the ruins. I stood on the remains of what was once called the Empire, and felt a strange silence that couldn't be called peace. Everything around still smoked, sparked, and trembled from recent explosions, and I, like a lone observer, tried to make sense of it all. I saw ruined cities reflected in the metallic surfaces of ships, and the twisted orbits of planets looked like scars on the face of the universe. In that moment, I realized for the first time that the history we had built for centuries didn't end in heroic triumph, but in a slow and painful collapse, one we accelerated with our own ambition, fear, and mistakes. And yet, among the ruins, I felt a faint but persistent glimmer of hope. Small islands of life, new settlements, lights on the horizon, as if the galaxy itself whispered that even after destruction, a new order is possible. I noticed how the remnants of the fleet slowly began to regroup, even though command was completely broken, and the admirals, once proud and unshakable, now wandered through their personal corridors of power, finding neither support nor purpose. I tried to assess who among the survivors could maintain even a shred of order, but I knew the old structures no longer existed, and we were forced to create new rules here and now. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers across the control panel, realizing that every command, every signal now mattered not for victory, but for survival, for preserving humanity among the wreckage, and that this fragile balance would become the foundation of a new world. Looking at the stars felt both cold and comforting. They shone as if watching everything unfold from the heights of centuries, without emotion, but with infinite patience. I felt that in their cold, eternal light was a lesson. Nothing lasts forever, and even the greatest empires can vanish, leaving behind only memory. But memory isn't just recollection. It's a seed from which something new can grow. I saw the first attempts at rebuilding rise from the ruins, small settlements gathering around the light like moths to a lamp, and I understood that life doesn't ask for permission. It simply continues. Each step across the ruined bridge of the capital echoed through my bones, and the sight of the empty streets made me think of the thousands who would never see this world again. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the lives lost, for the mistakes that led to collapse, and relief that no one could build a new order on lies and fear anymore. I saw children, now orphans, carefully walking among the ruins, and I understood that they would be the ones to give the world new meaning. And in that moment, I felt for the first time that the end of the empire wasn't an absolute catastrophe, but the beginning of something we don't yet understand, something already alive in every breath, in every flicker of light among the ashes. I sat at the edge of a shattered plaza, watching the remains of ships slowly fade into the nebula, and thought about how easily control can be lost, how quickly the world can change in a single moment. But in the middle of that chaos, I saw tiny sparks of order, small rules forming naturally, because life doesn't tolerate a vacuum. I knew we faced a long road ahead, that rebuilding would be painful, full of mistakes and betrayals, but now there was a chance to create something honest, something lasting. And maybe that mattered more than any imperial glory that once seemed eternal. Looking at the shimmering starlight, I realized we had lived through the age of the empire, but its end didn't mean total disappearance. The seeds of a new order had already been planted in the hearts of those who survived, in the ruins of cities, in the determination of the living not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And I, standing among the wreckage, felt both the bitterness of loss and a quiet joy. We had lost the old world, but gained the chance to build a new one. And maybe that's where true hope lies. The starlight no longer felt cold. It reflected possibility, the chance to see order born from chaos, and to see that even after collapse, life continues to shine.